Hi, welcome to Algebra 2 Common Core. Tonight in lesson number 1 in Unit 13, we're going to look at types of statistical studies. Data is everywhere. It's in our newspapers, it's in our science classes, it shows up in economics, medicine, and anywhere else that variability occurs. So first of all, the definition of statistics. Statistics is the science of collecting and analyzing data in large quantities to interpret, present, and organize the information. So in this unit, we're going to be working with statistical studies. So let's go ahead and look at the 4-step process for a statistical study. The first step is going to be to ask a question. That can be answered with data. Step number 2 is going to be to collect appropriate data. We're going to be looking in this section on how to collect that data. In step number 3, we're going to organize and analyze the data. That's what we'll be looking at in some future lessons in this unit, how to organize and analyze the data. And lastly, step number 4 is going to be to arrive at a conclusion in the context of the original question. We will see this whole process as we go through Unit 13. Let's begin by looking at the 3 main types of statistical studies. The first study that we're going to learn about is called an observational study. An observational study is when one or more variables are observed with no attempt to affect the outcomes. So an observational study merely means that we are going to observe something that is already occurring usually. A disadvantage of observational study is the following. The disadvantage of an observational study is that a relationship found in an observational study does not mean that one causes the other. So it's not possible to link the two things as a cause and effect relationship. For example, if cell phone usage is linked to brain cancer, that doesn't mean that cell phone usage could cause, maybe it could, but it doesn't necessarily cause brain cancer. We would have to investigate what other factors could have caused it. So an observational study allows us to make observations, but not to relate it with causes and effects. The second type of statistical study is an experiment. Within an experiment, subjects are assigned to treatments to investigate what effect the treatment has on some response. Some important characteristics of experiments are, first of all, random assignment of subjects to treatments. Random assignment is done so that we create comparable treatment groups. So random assignment is going to be really, really important when we are talking about experiments. Secondly, cause and effect conclusions can be made in an experiment as long as the treatment groups are comparable. So that's what's going to be a little bit different from what we saw above on the observational study. We can make a cause and effect conclusion with an experiment. Some of the important terms within an experiment: the subject is going to be the participant in the experiment. A response variable is going to be the variable that is not controlled by the researcher, but instead it's the variable that is measured as part of the experiment. Lastly, the word treatment just means the condition or conditions to which the subjects are randomly assigned by the researcher. In class, we're going to be talking about lots of examples of experiments and looking at what's the subject, what's the response variable, and what's the treatment for each of them. The last kind of statistical study that's going to be important for us in this unit is called a survey. I'm sure that many of you have participated in surveys in the past. Within a survey, we are going to ask groups of people to respond to questions. These questions can take many different formats. So, an advantage of a survey, one advantage, is that they can take many forms. Perhaps you've participated in a survey on the telephone or possibly online. Also, when you walk into places like stores, you might have surveys in situations like that. The second advantage is that surveys are very efficient. They're a good way to be able to gather data from a large population. So we can ask a lot of people at once by filling out an online survey or possibly by making phone calls. So we can very efficiently come up with a lot of data. The third advantage is that surveys are applicable to a wide range of topics. We can ask questions about political views, we can ask questions about your favorite soda, or what your sports team might want to do. There's a lot of different topics that can be applied to a survey. Some of the disadvantages of surveys: sometimes we have to worry about whether the respondent has been honest. So a survey is dependent on the responder's honesty. Secondly, sometimes it can be flawed by non-response. So if not enough people have answered your survey, then you're not going to have enough data to analyze. And thirdly, a survey can possibly be biased. We're going to talk about that word biased in a few minutes. So with all statistical studies, our steps are going to be to question, to collect data, to organize that data, and then to reach a conclusion. So these 4 steps are going to be really, really important throughout this unit as we pursue the study of statistics. We've been talking about that word random as we've talked about our different kinds of statistical studies. Let's take a look at the role of randomization. There are actually 2 kinds of randomization that we're going to see. The first kind is called random selection. That's randomly selecting a sample from a population. So for example, let's say that we want to ask for what people's favorite foods are in the cafeteria. So we're going to do a survey and we're going to go around and we're going to ask different people about what they like for the food in the cafeteria. We will randomly select those whom we will ask. So for example, we wouldn't go to one table and ask all 10 people at that table and have that be our entire sample. But the random selection allows generalization to a population. And it's used in well-defined observational studies. Sometimes the subjects in an experiment are randomly selected, but mostly we're going to use this random selection when we're talking about observational studies such as surveys. The second type of random idea would be the random assignment. That refers to randomly assigning the subjects in an experiment to treatments. So the random assignment allows for cause and effect. We are going to pick different treatments and we are going to randomly choose which subjects are going to be assigned each treatment. And then we will be able to see if there is a cause and effect conclusion. These are used in well-designed experiments. So this is where the researcher is setting up the random assignment of the subjects within the experiment. The next word we want to look at is bias. I've talked about what happens if our questions don't give us good data. Some of that may be based on bias. Bias is when we have prejudice in favor of or against one thing, one person, one group, or one belief. So for example, we can take a look at the new fire station that was built on Center. If we only asked the people in the neighborhood around Center if they wanted a new fire station in their neighborhood, they would be biased because the fire station was being built in their neighborhood. So they're going to give a different answer. They're going to have a prejudice either in favor of or against the idea because of the fact that they live in the neighborhood where the fire station is being built. So we have to be careful when we are working with statistics to try to eliminate as much bias as possible. And a way of eliminating bias is to make sure that we are working with randomization in all of our statistical studies. Let's take a look at a few examples of statistical studies and see if we can answer these questions. So in example number 1, it says if you were trying to conduct a survey of political preferences for likely voters in an upcoming election, and you decided to dial 1,000 randomly generated landline phone numbers. So we're not talking about cell numbers, we're talking about landline phone numbers. Why might this still introduce bias into the sampling? So first of all, we've already said that we've got randomly generated numbers. So we know that we're trying to eliminate bias, but why do we still have bias in this sampling? Well, of course, it's because we are just focusing on people that have landline phone numbers. Right now, most people that have landline phone numbers are probably the older part of our population. So they may have a bias towards a particular political preference, and we're only going to be talking to the people that have landline phone numbers, so we may be introducing bias into our study just by the fact that we are only using landline phone numbers. Let's take a look at example 2. The management of a health club has received complaints about the temperature of the water in the pool. They want to sample 50 out of the 200 members of the club to determine if the temperature of the pool should be changed. How should this sample be chosen? So first of all, anytime we are choosing a sample, we've got to make sure that we are talking about randomization. So we want random selection of the people that are going to be asked about the pool temperature. Secondly, we want to make sure that we aren't introducing bias. So for example, we don't want to pick the first 50 people that enter the gym in the morning. because the first 50 people are either experiencing the pool very warm because the pool has been heated during the night, or very chilly because maybe the pool hasn't been heated during the night. So those people may be biased based on the time of day that they enter the pool. So we would rather take all 200 members, and to do a random selection, we can think about maybe randomly selecting their membership numbers. So we can put into a computer a random generator and select from their membership numbers. So we're trying to get as random of a population as possible when we sample the 50 members. We also want to make sure that the 50 that we choose covers a variety of ages. We want both genders to be asked so that, again, we are eliminating as much bias as possible. In example number 3, it says, in an experiment, a university biologist wants to compare the effects of 2 weed killers on pansies. So you'll notice, let's go through these steps. Step number 1 was, what's our question? So our question is, we want to compare the 2 weed killers on the pansies. Does one weed killer work better than another weed killer? So we have to figure out how we want to collect data. She chooses 24 plants. So randomly selecting 12 plants to receive weed killer A and then assigning the rest to weed killer B would help ensure that the plants in each group are fairly similar. So again, we want random selection. So next, the question is, how might the biologist go about randomly assigning 12 plants from the 24 candidates to receive weed killer A? Here's a possibility. Could she be sure to get exactly 12 plants assigned to weed killer A and 12 plants assigned to weed killer B by tossing a fair coin for each plant? And if it turns up heads up, the plant would get weed killer A, and tails up would get weed killer B. Now that does seem like it's going to be a random assignment of the plants to either weed killer A or weed killer B. Our problem is, if we keep flipping the coin, we won't necessarily get 12 plants in group A and 12 plants in group B. That's just not how fair coin tosses go. So we're not guaranteed that half and half will be heads and tails. So it says, if not, suggest a method that you could use. Again, thinking about the idea that we have to have random selection here, or random assignment, I guess, would be what we want to talk about in this case. What we could do is assign each plant a number from 1 to 24. And then put the numbers 1 through 24 in a bag. And select 12 of the numbers. That way, we are sure that we're going to get 12 plants that are going to be given weed killer A, and then the ones that aren't selected will be given weed killer B. So this would be a good way of coming up with random assignment of the plants into the 2 groups. Now, of course, there's probably multiple ways that we could think of this, and that's what we're going to focus on in our first 2 days of studying statistical studies, ways of collecting our data. So thanks very much for working with me tonight on the beginning of statistics. We'll be talking a lot more about statistical studies in class over the next 2 days. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.